Steve Klein joining me. Good to see you again, Steve. And I noticed you got a little backdrop and all that going there.
Yeah, we got a whole
you're getting up to speed on how this all looks. This is pretty good. We're gonna. One thing that you got to try, as long as you're getting more savvy at this program here, if you notice, and this is just between me and Steve, folks, I'll get back to the radio audience in just a moment. If you look off to the left-hand side of this program, you see something there that looks kind of like a briefcase?
Yeah.
One of these days, click on that. Do you see that little graph I have below me with my name and other information?
Oh, man, we could do the whole approach there, eh?
Yeah, that's right. All of that is in there. And also when I go to a commercial break, I put those pictures up. It's all in that briefcase. One of these days, just get into that and start to play with it. And then when you come on, we can really have you guys looking select. All right, so Steve is coming in from on our video cast, for those who'd like to watch him there as well, from Wyoming Liberty Group. You're going to be down here on Saturday to talk about Agenda 21. What are you going to focus your little talk around?
My talk, Glenn, is going to largely focus on current realities in property law, kind of the multifaceted approach of smart growth. And I use smart growth far more often than I use Agenda 21.
Okay.
I think it's the distinctly American title that's been put on it, wherever it kind of comes from. But interestingly, and I've been working on property rights a little bit down here at Y Liberty for ever since I got here about 2.5, 3 years ago. And it's a tough area. We have, this is an area where we have lawyers in Wyoming that can practice land law all the time. We have lawyers here that can practice water law all the time. So there's enough business to go around. But as far as addressing zoning and all the other facets of whatever, smart growth, it's going to be an uphill battle, a quintessentially local battle. I was really excited. Was yesterday you had Taylor on the show?
Yes, it was.
You also had a call in from your local planning board, it sounded like.
Right.
And I'm really hoping that members of that, and I think they have an advisory, community advisory staff of some kind, or people sitting on a board. I hope there will be that turnout. Because this is a local discussion, and I also think it'll kind of temper some of the discussion as well, because I think this area in particular, it's kind of, it tends to drive a lot of vitriol. And I understand passions. I understand a lot of, the drive behind this and the passion for property rights, but understand that you're going to be dealing with your neighbors in this fight. And so be neighborly, and I'm really hoping there can be a discussion on that front. So otherwise, though, Glenn, I'm kind of happy to announce here with the serendipitous timing that as far as a response on another kind of land rights issue is going to be heard in House Transportation this afternoon here down in Cheyenne, or down here in Cheyenne for English-speaking people. There's going to be a bill, House Bill 182, is going before House Transportation, and this is basically an attempt to recognize rights of way that go over federal land. It's kind of a little-known fact that under the law, under federal law, when they passed the Federal Land Policy Management Act in 1976, they recognized any right-of-way that was going over federal land prior to the passage of that bill. So you had since the Mining Act of 1866, people and states have been allowed to do this. So even before Wyoming was a state, people have been able to forge these rights of way. And it's been pretty well, it's just kind of been status quo. I mean, I don't know about Campbell County, certainly Laramie County, we don't have much federal land. But if you get onto the western part of Wyoming, Hot Springs County, Fremont County, and you start seeing just how many two-tracks and trails and roads we have going over federal land that people are still using to this day that have been there since well before 1976. The question is, in Utah, about 10 years ago, the feds decided to start closing some of those roads. And Utah was the counties, Kane County, Utah in particular, was very successful in asserting its claims against the federal government, saying, listen, by your own law, you cannot do this. So meanwhile, in the meantime, Wyoming, of course, we've had some serious problems with the roadless rule in wilderness areas around Wyoming where we can't construct new roads. And unfortunately, we lost that lawsuit in the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, and the Supreme Court doesn't want to hear the case. So that case is pretty much over. But that doesn't mean that the battle is over. We should really now really make a concerted effort in Wyoming on a county-by-county basis to find all of these roads, document them, and file quitclaim deeds to assert that, well, these are our roads, these are our rights-of-way. And I think House Bill 182 will really take that in a step in the right direction, because currently our state law is far too restrictive and doesn't really give counties the power to do this.
Well, I'm asking a question and making a comment. Try turning the volume down just a little bit on your speakers. I think there's a bit of feedback here, and that will help. There's a little bit of a loop back, and that'll help that. But don't turn down so much that you can't hear me. Okay, Steve Klein, Wyoming Liberty Group, is talking with me right now, and he will be in town on Saturday, along with me, and Taylor Haynes will be at the library at 9 o'clock in the Wyoming room. And yes, there will be snacks, so you guys don't pass out from starvation while you're listening to us. So let me ask you then, because this is the first time hearing about this, what you just told us. It's really interesting that, I'm sorry, but we're really lacking for good press across the state of Wyoming, and important stuff like this just doesn't get out, which is why I keep trying to turn people toward your group, at Wyoming. And by the way, what is the website for those who haven't heard of you yet?
You can check us out at wyliberty.org, wyliberty.org.
And the feedback is gone, so that was perfect, whatever you just did there. Good. Okay, so now let me ask you then, does that have anything to do? I know we're not, you don't want to get into it, and I understand why the Agenda 21 label on that, but does that fall under the same kind of a plan? I mean, is this something that came from inside of Wyoming, or where did this come from?
Well, Glenn, I really think the Agenda 21 was a conference the United Nations held in the early 1990s. And the trouble with that is I think it's caused people, they research Agenda 21 and they kind of believe that was a starting point. And unfortunately, the facets, the prongs of Agenda 21, whether you call it smart growth or A21, have been around for a very long time. I mean, zoning is, make no mistake, the big tool for Agenda 21 or smart growth. This is the power, the police power of local governments, and in Wyoming, we've given the power to local localities to zone, and that is practically unlimited police power, as I'll discuss. And I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm not saying that that's the way things ought to be, but unfortunately, that's the way things are under the law. And that goes back to the Supreme Court decision in 1926. And if you look at the first comprehensive zoning plan was New York City in 1916. So that not only predates the United Nations, that predates the League of Nations, which was Woodrow Wilson's first attempt at an international type of thing. So that's why I want to, even Agenda 21 itself acknowledges that this is going to be a local fight. So what the High Plains Initiative showed, and that was a movement in Wyoming, a $300,000 project in Platte and Goshen County, that was an attempt to implement it was the starting point that was really going to lead to a comprehensive zoning plan that would have restricted growth to Torrington and Wheatland. I mean, there's other facets too that really do indicate nothing short of social engineering. So I understand, and again, I want to say there can be a heavy debate here, but it's just the passions get so high. And I think our experience here in Laramie County, as Taylor discussed yesterday with the Cheyenne Unified Development Code, did lead to some I think, changes on the city council as well as the county commission. But that still, at the end of the day, we have this code that's been ratified. And the question is, are we going to get rid of it entirely? Are we going to modify the worst parts of it? Because I don't know that people are willing to throw out all zoning. I mean, you can talk of cities like Houston that don't have any, and I certainly will discuss that on Saturday and some of the policy implications of that. But at the end of the day, zoning has been around not just in the United States, but particularly in Wyoming since practically the state was founded. So it's an argument you have to prepare for, and it goes well beyond a conference that was held in the early 1990s.
Well, and let me give you a great example of that. Here I am. My family has a cabin up in North Carolina, and we're near the town of Boone, literally settled by Daniel Boone. And they had signs going up around one election year, no zoning, because for the longest time, they simply had no rules in that county, no zoning at all. Sounds pretty good until somebody goes ahead and takes a distribution center, and I actually saw this happen, a big trucking distribution center and put it right next to some little old lady's house, and her property values, of course, now sunk because the distribution center, literally, you can stand on her porch and spit on the building next door. It's so close. Okay, we've got to have some zoning. Well, it didn't take but just a couple of years before the zoning board was out of control. So I guess, are we asking here, where do you draw this line?
Right, and I think that one of the differentiation between traditional zoning and between smart growth is that zoning has aimed to put controls on development, where you can develop, what you can develop where. Smart growth's objective is to stop development, period. Right. So I think that's what's led to the outcry. And I agree with you that it's all, I think that we're all libertarians until someone builds a distribution center next to our house, So there's a certain not in my backyard attitude that we also need to kind of combat. So that's why, Glenn, that I've been studying this for 2 years, but I still don't have a paper prepared. I'm still really dancing around the issues. Unlike constitutional rights like free speech, where I can really bang the drum and have really solid policy to back it up, property is a very nuanced area. And this goes all the way back. I was reading the other day, I found a citation to Thucydides, the history of the Peloponnesian War, where he gives what is probably one of the earliest descriptions of the tragedy of the commons. The fact is we have, and I think your caller from the county planning board yesterday, and I'm sorry if I'm getting that title wrong, but yesterday mentioned their main objective is to preserve infrastructure. I understand during the oil boom that Gillette actually grew to very quickly back during the last oil boom, and all of a sudden when that boom ended, Gillette dropped in population, and suddenly there was all this infrastructure left over that people still had to pay for or let kind of rot away. So these are, and that leads to other discussions as libertarians, as conservatives. What do we believe about privatizing utilities? And there's always the staunchest libertarians like to talk about privatizing roads. But again, that may be a great idea that's worth discussing, but it really has no history in the American experience.
All right, Steve Klein from Wyoming Liberty Group is on the video with me right now. Steve, we've got to come up with a name for this thing. I tell you, 8:18's the time. Got to pay some bills. More in just a moment. 8:21's the time. 682-1270 the phone number, and 307-682-1270 if you're outside the area code. And if you have a question for Steve Klein, Wyoming Liberty Group, who's joining us now on the video stream. Video stream, that's not bad, Steve.
Yeah.
I'll come up with some name somewhere around there. Okay, now, some people who hear me talk, and I'm very libertarian-ish, Steve, I will say that, well, Glenn, you're just against all kind of planning and ordinances whatsoever. And my answer is, well, no, I do think things need to be planned out. I grew up in Florida, where when I was a kid, there were 4 million people in Florida. Now there's 17 million people in Florida. And we had to plan things like, well, where are we going to get our water from? There's only so much water even in Florida available. And how do you lay out the grid for roads? And should you zone various parts of the city? So that doesn't necessarily come out of some UN agenda. And sometimes you end up stepping on some property rights in order to plan out a city. So here again, are we asking about where are we properly drawing the line and when have we gone too far?
Yeah, and this goes to the importance of federalism, Glenn, I'm going to be, I'm coming up from Laramie County. I'm a Cheyenne resident, and I'll be in Gillette, and I want to lay out where the state of the law is on a lot of issues. But as far as my opinion on what Gillette zoning should be, on Campbell County zoning, it's none of my business.
Yeah, it's Gillette's business, right?
And it's Gillette's business, and the same thing goes for Laramie County. And this is why this is kind of another one of these call to arms that, you've got to act locally in all things. And that's where things, this is one of the areas where even Agenda 21 itself, the document itself says, this is never going to work unless we have local participation. And there's been some, especially in the High Plains Initiative project and things like that, there's been a lot of allegations of the kind of cloak and dagger approach that they took to planning, that they had some visioning meetings throughout the counties where they've had people show up and they only ended up getting about 300 people. Rumor has it that a lot of those surveys were taken online by high school students, and well, these kids aren't even old enough to vote, but we're letting them plan out the county. So aside from that, and it really does go to this local government. I'm very happy to see people becoming more involved. But it's another problem with the Unified Development Code, and I was talking with some legislators yesterday here in Cheyenne that it's funny that until something happens, they hear nothing about it.
Yeah.
And that's where local involvement becomes so key. And it's like you said, maybe, we could have better press coverage. I think Campbell County, you guys are blessed to have the Campbell County Observer now, and so a little competition among the newspapers up there. That's a great thing. And, and as you said, you can always check our website, yliberty.org, and do follow even now. What's really interesting this legislative session as well is the website Twitter is becoming much more active. There's actually, it's hard to get into this, Glenn, because I'm talking about hashtags and other technological things. So the older audience might not follow along here, but there is a website called Twitter that you can follow individual reporters now from all the various news outlets who will be at the Wyoming legislature. I mean, heck, the Casper Star-Tribune has an office there, and you don't have to wait for the paper to come out. You can actually watch the Twitter feeds from committee hearings and things like that. And you'll see little things going on, and they'll live. Even myself, I have a Twitter account, and if I'm in a meeting, I'll kind of start tweeting about what's going on. So that kind of involvement now, I think that increases access to involvement in state government. But with local government, yeah, I mean, I've got to admit, I am a Cheyenne resident for 3 years, and I've never been to a city council meeting. That's a problem for somebody claiming to be locally involved here. I've never been to a county commission meeting. I've met with commissioners, I've met with council members, but I've never done that. And that takes a whole lot of commitment. And I think it takes also, to get up to speed, takes a lot of study. And I'm going to be bringing with me, one thing I decided to put together was a best of the best reading list to understand what smart growth is on the national scene, and to get caught up as to what's happened in Wyoming, because I think that education is very important to combating this kind of thing, and to formulating where your opinions lie on property rights.
Okay, when I come back in just a moment, you're going to see me talking to my sportsman for just a minute, and then I'll get back to you. And, of course, we always have some sick, disgusting, disturbing story before he gets into sports. But what I want to ask you next is we have to worry, I think, about a few things that are happening in Cheyenne, because we are talking about local, but things that are coming out of Cheyenne that might have to do with smart growth and might affect us here locally. We'll get into that next. Steve Klein is streaming in. I'm going with that one, Steve.
We call it Glenn Cam.
Yeah. 8:34 is the time. News Talk 1270 KIML, the radio station. My name is Glenn Woods. Thanks for joining me. Steve Klein is from Wyoming Liberty Group, and he is on the video stream. There, I got it. Video stream. The sun suddenly hit you there. Are you by a window where suddenly?
Yeah, my assistant was in here and decided the glare on the sign was too much, so now I can just have a completely polarized face here.
Yeah. Well, you needed a tan there. You did. So that'll get you one, I'm sure. Okay. Anyway, Steve Klein is with Wyoming Liberty Group. He will be up here on Saturday, and of course, your questions. You're about to get a question from a caller. One's calling in right now. If you want to join us on Saturday, we'll be at the library from 9 to 1 o'clock. Yes, food will be available so you don't pass out from hunger. We will be talking about Agenda 21. And I've got to ask Steve some questions about possible legislation with sustainable growth that's going through the Wyoming legislature. But first, let's go to the phones. This is Glenn. Who's on the phone?
Good morning, Glenn. This is Bill.
Yes, sir.
I was calling in to respectfully to make a point.
Okay.
You were saying earlier or whatever during that Clinton testimony that they changed.
Oh, let's say try that in the 9 o'clock hour when it's open phones. Okay, I want to stick with Steve Klein right now. Is there possible sustainable growth legislation going through the Wyoming legislature right now that we have to worry about, Steve?
Glenn, and I haven't read every single bill up there. I am not familiar with anything right now. Please, callers, if anyone knows anything, correct me if I'm wrong.
Has there been in the past?
There was one bill that raised some concern. I think it was House Bill 42, that basically was a modification of an old law. And again, this goes back to the fact that this is an old thing for I think since the 1970s. At some point, the state of Wyoming required every county in Wyoming to actually make a comprehensive land use plan. So every county already has one, and some people saw House Bill 42 as requiring a new one And in fact, that's not the case. What in fact House Bill 42 does is actually removes some superfluous language, and more importantly, says that land use plans are not to require zoning. So what happened was it's funny because the Wyoming Supreme Court said in the 1980s already that a county plan couldn't be used to zone. You have to pass those ordinances separately. So here we are almost 30 years later, and I think the law is finally catching up. But that's one of the hard things too, Glenn, that I can understand is difficult. And I think this happens with legislators as well, is when you read a bill is, especially if it's modifying an old law, it's only going to list the parts that it's adding or modifying. It's not going to list the entire law. And it's sometimes really hard to distinguish between what's new and what's old. So certainly that's another way why Liberty can be a resource. And my email is on our website, whyliberty.org. And I really encourage that, especially during legislative session. I'm not just a resource for legislators. I'm a resource for any Wyomingite who has any questions on anything at all. So.
Well, and some of the questions that some listeners have given to me, for instance, let's say I own in fact, yesterday, during the interview yesterday with Taylor Haynes, he brought this up. Let's say I own 35 acres of land. I want to go ahead and run some horses on my land or put some cows on my land. I want to go ahead and use the water on my land. At what point does the state or the county get to come in and tell me you can't do that? And how much freedom do I have on my own land?
Well, I mean, water especially, Glenn, is the real clincher because we've had in the state of Wyoming, our Constitution has given the state, first and foremost priority over all water. Of course, law since then has very well respected first in time, first in right. And it's my understanding, and again, I'm far from an expert, my understanding is that since then there's been some now developments over groundwater, what constitutes, water underground, surface water, atmospheric water. It's really fascinating, but the fact, it's my understanding that there's some controversies there, but by and large, water law has been pretty consistent in Wyoming. However, the state, has since our founding maintained, because it's such a precious resource, gets priority over that. And water is life, so that's a pretty big reservation there, a pretty big grant of power to the state. So when we talk about at what point, this is when I hate copping out, Glenn, but federalism is key here. Especially when it comes to, if, for example, Jackson Hole, Wyoming, if they want to maintain their beautiful resort community that only allows, and I'll discuss this in detail some more, but their development is very restrictive on the few non-federal land that they even have in Teton County. Good for them. What works for Teton County is not how it has to be in Laramie County, or in Campbell County for that matter. So it's really at what point, to draw this bright line, that's great. Do it on a county by county basis, but don't expect the Constitution of the United States, much less the Constitution of Wyoming, to draw this line.
And some of the fights that I see coming up, and I've if you want to ever see my head exploding, you wonder why these walls here behind me are padded and gray. Here's one of the reasons why. So let's say I'm building a house, and I decide how I want my house built. Well, then all of a sudden, here comes the city or the county saying, you can't install this, but you must install that. You have to use this kind of light bulb. Oh, and don't forget, we're going to put those smart meters into your house. Your house can only be so big. And here again, I thought it was my house. Well, I do understand some rules and regulations. You don't want the place burning down, so we don't have to call the fire department. You want some decent fire code regulations and so on. Back to the Agenda 21 thing. So here comes international fire codes. And again, at some point, I have to stop and ask, pardon me, whose house is this? And when can I tell the city or the county, in this case, either one, get out of my house. It's my decision. I'll put the kind of toilet in my bathroom that I want.
Right, and I think that's been the biggest concern my biggest concern with the Unified Development Code is it goes so far as to turn government into an art critic. You start talking about designs and setbacks and how big your sign can be and how big the letters on the sign can be, et cetera, et cetera. It runs into real problems, and this has happened previously in Cheyenne, when they start regulating where and when you can put out political signs. And now you're running into free speech issues. So that's really, I think, one of the most obvious, and it's interesting when that becomes one of the most I think, best ways to attack these kind of zoning plans, because you point out, listen, not only are you adding to the cost of development by requiring all these, awnings and stuff like that, so you're hindering development there, but you're also, this is the most blatant example of government has no interest in doing this, okay? I mean, you making the city pretty is not really is probably a blatant, forget drawing the line, you've crossed it, okay? Yeah. So that I think is probably one of the more glaring examples of the problems with the Unified Development Code here in Cheyenne. And I think you point that out as far as the safety, where safety and reasonable regulation ends, and then where government as art critic begins. Again, that is why local involvement is so important. And so that, the wisest, get your wisest neighbor in there who has a good idea of what's going on and a good grasp on economics. And I think that can really help and change some minds.
I got to run to Coach's Corner real quick. I've got some more examples from around the country. Again, things that make my head explode, Steve. We'll talk about that and find out if we have to worry about any of that coming to Wyoming, Cheyenne, or here in Campbell County. Just a moment. Steve is my guest. He's joining us on video stream from Cheyenne, Wyoming Liberty Group. And you can go ahead. What's your website again, Steve?
We're at wyliberty.org, wyliberty.org.
And they can follow you on Facebook and Twitter and all that good stuff, and I do myself. So, okay, here's a couple of quick stories for you. Here I am in Boston, all right, and I'm just trying to get somewhere to a building that I can see, by the way, just up the road over there, and I spent about an hour trying to get to it, and I finally asked some local, I was living there at the time, but I'm new to Boston, how do you get there? And she honestly didn't know, and she grew up in Boston. Why? Poor planning. All right. I'm living in Orlando. Now, Orlando grew from a little one stoplight town, then all of a sudden some mouse moves to the area, and there's this big boom town, but they laid it out. So if you get lost in Orlando, you'll figure it out. Problem, Steve, is just recently, again, head explodes. That's why the walls are gray. That's why they're padded. Here's a guy who decides he's going to grow a vegetable garden in his front yard. I saw pictures of it online. It's beautiful, frankly. I mean, the guy did a great job. You can walk right down the sidewalk and see tomatoes and cabbage and all this kind of stuff. City shows up and says, well, you can't do that because of the following codes. And they want him to rip his garden up. And I'm thinking, well, whose property is that? So here's a good example of where planning that was originally good planning got way out of control, and I can sit here all day and give you examples like that. So what we're talking about, both you and I here, are getting people down to the meetings to make sure the kind of planning that's happening in the community doesn't get out of control. Am I right about that?
Agreed. And I first of all, I do believe I read somewhere that the city of Orlando thankfully backed off on that. They were going to fine them a certain amount of money a day, but and the other interesting thing, Glenn, is that associations, are also kind of a key here. That let's say, like you mentioned, there's a neighborhood here. What does the city of Orlando have to get involved in a neighborhood with you? Because some people want to live in, Stepford, where there's, restrictions on the number of lawn ornaments you can put out. I certainly would rather live in a neighborhood without lawn ornaments. So you can do this. You can build a neighborhood and have a private association in your neighborhood. You can even build it with restrictive covenants, and anyone who moves in knows what the requirements are. And I mean, I understand there's just as much, if you want to see tyranny and pettiness, well, find the neighborhood, the homeowners association. But
well, in fact, the next novel I have come out takes place in one of those association with real homeowners association horror stories, and people are going to think it's fiction, but it's based on fact. But anyway, continue.
Yeah, but nevertheless, we have to respect the ability to contract and the ability of free people to make those conforming things. On the other hand, if you want to live in a more free neighborhood, well, go ahead and do that. The city doesn't have to be involved and impose these regulations across the board. So I mean, it can even come down to federalism isn't just the federal government in D.C., the state government in Washington, and then local governments around Wyoming. It could go down to the neighborhood level, and I think the more power we divest from centralized government as a general rule, that's the better, especially when you're dealing with issues like the garden on your front lawn,
Well, I'm going to throw you a real curveball. Maybe I am here. You might be able to handle this one. I get a kick out of when I take a look at communities that are making money off of fining people. They continue to make up rules so they can go ahead and collect the fines. Or for that matter, and this is another thing that drives me crazy, even in this town, and I've seen it all across America, you own a business, you want to put a sign up on a business, you got to pay to put the sign up because there's some city sign ordinance, and they're going to tell you what kind of sign and what colors you're allowed to use, what size the sign, and where the sign has to be positioned. And by the way, you also owe them a yearly fee for that as well. And I kind of wonder if that was all part of that sustainable growth or just an excuse to collect money. Either way, it's got to go.
Yeah, agreed. And and again, the interesting thing is that a lot of rights and a lot of pieces of government, and especially whether it's smart growth or Agenda 21, when you start looking at the tentacles of how far these things reach. I mentioned free speech issues earlier, but fundamentally economic liberty. And now, we're in this, the longest recession in United States history. I don't care what the economists say.
Right.
Jobs are still gone. People are still unemployed. It's really tough out there. And we have regulation upon regulation. We have now 1 in 3 jobs in the United States requires a license to do it. And now you want to start up a small business in one of those areas that doesn't require a license. Forget barbering or cosmetology, and now apparently someone wants to license acupuncturists here in Wyoming. That's one of the bills that just came out the other day. Glenn, I don't know how Wyoming ever got so far without a 33-page acupuncture cartel,
there was one I got a kick out of. There's a young lady here who's on our sales staff, and she gets her eyelashes done. Don't ask me. I don't know what these women are doing in these places. And she gets her eyelashes done every so often. You have to be licensed for that in the state of Wyoming. I'm thinking, what for? I don't understand. But again, I kind of wonder are they actually controlling it? Are they saving us from something that's dangerous, or are they just trying to collect a fee?
Yeah, well, we live in a nation of people who obey the law by and large, Glenn. So when you look at, enforcement is often not really the problem. It's really the fact the law exists in the first place for no particular reason other than to shut people out of competition. Right. And I've always viewed it, especially with professional licensing, and again, I don't mean to get too far off topic here, but that is just one of these hindrances. And then, just to put up a sign for your business, and we've had that same problem in Cheyenne. So, that's deregulation is becoming all the more important because people are trying to. I believe people also, by and large, want to work. They want to live a productive life. It's not about making money; it's about accomplishing things. And to have a state and be a local government, state government, and the feds even. Until a few days ago, Glenn, and I'll give a plug for another think tank, a national group called the Institute for Justice. They just won a case against the IRS. The IRS was going to try and license every tax preparer. So anyone out there who knows how to do someone else's taxes and was getting money for it was going to have to get a federal approval to do so. And thankfully, IJ won that case. But it's crazy. So that's really what it goes into, and that's why I think, I guess wrapping up here, the conclusion of fighting these local battles is have all these facts at your disposal, and really, really make that pronged approach. Like, listen, okay, it's great that we want to have a good, pretty controlled community here, but what we're forgetting is American dynamism. What we're forgetting is we don't know what the future holds. Even this idea of when smart growth is sold in Wyoming, they often talk about preserving our cultural heritage and things like that. Well, Wyoming is a fairly young state, and if you think it looks anything today like it did even 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, you're dreaming. This illusion of permanence is something we let fall into our culture, and it's probably one of the bad sides of cliched conservatism, that we believe we can keep everything the same. I believe conservatism is about enduring principles. I don't believe it's about enduring states, enduring lifestyles and things of that nature. So that's where smart growth, it's one of its greatest follies, is this idea that you can not only preserve the things you like necessarily, but also that you can predict future growth. Even the High Plains Initiative was designed and sold on the idea that there was going to be a huge oil play in eastern Wyoming. Well, now that oil play is kind of petering out before it even really began. So, oops, that was $300,000 of some private money, but some government money wasted on a really stupid study that is already pretty irrelevant.
Well, and let me ask you here in the last couple of minutes that we have left, we were talking, you keep using the word sold to us, and I'm thinking, well, actually, that's a pretty good term, because I talked about this with Taylor Haynes yesterday. There's an interesting way when they come in with this sustainable development idea that they sell it to us. It's often by dangling money in front of our faces, isn't it?
Right. And that's one of the two other prongs. I talk about zoning as the worst prong and the most prevalent prong in smart growth movements. But there's also subsidies and there's corporatism. There's a great publication I'm going to bring along, because it's not great in content, but it's great in revealing what smart growth is all about. It's being really sold to rural communities, especially from the Rust Belt through the West, as a way to improve your community. And how do you do that? We'll start shoveling money into select projects. So this subsidizing, whether it's, that's the funny part. We have to make it really hard to start a tattoo parlor and put up a sign for that. But if we really like the business, like a creamery or something, we'll go ahead and shovel a lot of money in its direction, whether it's profitable or not. And then it goes into corporatism as well. This is the big problem. I think a big problem in Wyoming is that you might have these regulations, but it's really regulations for thee and not for me. The Jackson Hole experience, what I'll get into, is that it's funny that if you're a local, if you live there and you're just a regular homeowner there, you might have a lot of trouble getting into business. But if you're one of the resort people, oh my goodness, they will bend over backwards to let you do just about whatever you want. So it's this unequal protection under the law. It's really a certain level. To a certain level, it's boss hog in Wyoming. He can do whatever he wants, and this goes not just for Jackson, but I think that's how it is in most cities here. That you can find an exception to the rule if you're well connected, but it's anyone who wants to enter the market that gets shut out. So there's the dangling money thing is huge, but equally important is this corporatist aspect.
I also kind of wonder when they dangle money like that, and this is something I laugh and cry at the same time. The beauty of them dangling money to get all of this stuff done, to sell us on all of this stuff, is these people are running out of money. Margaret Thatcher was right. The problem with socialism is sooner or later you run out of other people's money. So at some point, as they try to sell us on all of this smart growth, don't they run out of money and wind up with, we wind up right back where we started from?
Glenn, I think it's becoming more and more on everybody's mind as to where the money's going. You're going to raise the gas tax right now. That's probably going to make it through the Senate. Of course, you can call your legislator and try and make that, bring a stop to that. I think everybody just noticed in the United States as a whole, I think I speak for everyone, that your taxes just went up at least 1%. That's the payroll tax. To a social, if you're young like me, that's I'm 29 years old in a few weeks, and I don't expect that Social Security or Medicare to be there waiting for me at the end. I'd be stupid to predict that or to assume that. So the money is now just being spent, and every state keeps raising taxes, including Wyoming, while our federal taxes just jumped by leaps and bounds. And you're right. I mean, they're just going to keep taking more, and meanwhile, they won't acknowledge they have a spending problem. And we have a spending problem even here in Wyoming. So I'm with you, and I'm not an economist. We have one. You should have Sven Larson on your show sometime. I'm sure he'd be happy to talk about it.
This is Glenn. Who's on the phone?
You say you were going to record this on Saturday?
Yes, sir, I am.
Awesome. Thanks.
I'll put it up online. What he was talking about, as I mentioned, is yesterday, Steve, I'm going to go ahead and bring a camera there and bring just a little bit of audio equipment. I'm going to go ahead and put a little lapel mic on you, and everybody's going to get recorded, and I'm going to try. We'll see how my editing skills are, too. Well, it's not a matter of how to edit. It's a matter of what to cut, to condense it down to maybe even just an hour, because that's quite a bit to put up on YouTube. That way, not just myself, but callers like that and you at Wyoming Liberty Group can just go ahead and take the whole meeting and just spread it around the state, because not only do people need to know about what we're bringing up, but people need to go ahead and spread the word about it. Now, on that note, Steve will be the second speaker. Jeff Hamas, am I pronouncing that right? John Birch Society. Have you met him before, Steve?
I have met Jeff. I believe it's Hymus.
Hymus, thank you very much. Steve Klein, Wyoming Liberty Group, will be speaking second. That'll be at 10 a.m. Taylor Haynes, Dr. Taylor Haynes at 11 o'clock, and I'll go ahead and wrap everything up. And then, of course, food will be available as well, so you don't pass out from starvation while you're learning all of this. Starts at 9 o'clock, goes till 1 p.m. It'll be at the Campbell County Public Library. And once again, so everybody knows, Steve, how do they get a hold of Wyoming Liberty Group so they can go ahead and look up again, you're, I think, a better source of information than AP News. How do they get a hold of you?
They can check us out on our website, wyliberty.org, WYLIBERTY, and of course we're available by phone here at the office. So all that information is available online.
All right, thank you, Steve, and I'm looking forward to seeing you on Saturday. All right,
Likewise, Glenn.
Fox News is next.